Hey everyone, welcome back to Installation 00 and today's episode of Gold vs Silver. Apologies that it wasn't yesterday, as you know we're getting into the habit of doing. I was a little swamped with some business that needed my attention, and by the time I got all of that done there was no hours left in the day to actually sit down and do the run through of episode 6. But we're a day late. Here's Gold vs Silver for episode 6. The episode starts with Chief obviously suffering something approximating PTSD. He's had a lot happen in recent episodes. The interaction with the artifact has taken its toll on his central nervous system. His sudden ability to feel and be emotionally compromised as a consequence of removing his hormone regulation chip means that most of his emotions are new and uncharted to him. His own interpretations of failing the mission of retrieving the artifact adding to his self-doubt. He has a compromised mental state due to the realization of the lies that he's been told for all of his life regarding his parents, his life before conscription, and everything that has happened since. And coming to his senses briefly to find Kai, a fellow Spartan and someone he considers family, in brutal agony following the events of the previous episode. Even for a Spartan, that is a lot to take on board all at once. We get some scenes of Chief exacting a form of revenge upon Halsey, although it's more so to find out the limits of what Cortana is capable of, whether or not she is able to take over his body. The peculiar thing about this situation is that we know that Cortana can take control of his body. We've seen it in earlier episodes, when she takes over while he's holding the artifact, and the artifact shuts down when Chief's consciousness is overwritten with Cortana, showing that the status of Reclaimer is not just biological but based more upon the active consciousness of the individual. While yes, she says all she can do is overload his neural pathways and create a state of stasis, that should be something akin to unconsciousness, in which case his muscles should relax and he should collapse, yet he stands there the entire time that he's in stasis. Chief's body even moves his head slightly during his stasis in the previous episode when he attempted to hit Halsey. So she obviously can take over his body, yet in this circumstance where Halsey's life is in mortal danger, Cortana refuses to take control of the Chief, calling his bluff to the point that Chief has to pull Halsey out of the room that's to be decontaminated with split seconds to spare. It's odd that she chose not to act and took such a risk that could very well have resulted in Halsey receiving a lethal dose of high energy ultraviolet radiation. During this scene, Chief speaks of Roman Quinn, citing that he was no ordinary shipbuilder and that he was solely responsible for modernising the entire UNSC fleet, but that his real genius lays in knowing the limits of his own knowledge and thus knowing that any technology, no matter how advanced, can go wrong. This led him to build failsafes into all of his work, all of it with the exception of one, the UV decontamination system. And by all appearances, this one mistake, this one instance where he forgot to install a failsafe, was the very thing that killed him. The biosensors that detect if a person is present before or during decontamination accidentally shut off, meaning a room can be decontaminated with a person still inside, something that shouldn't be able to happen. Not only was this the end of Quinn, but the mistake was never patched, meaning Chief could exploit this same system problem in his attempt to ascertain the failsafes of Cortana. A poetic symmetry if ever there was one. In the Gold timeline, there is no Roman Quinn. In fact, in the Gold timeline, and one can assume in the Silver timeline as well, UNSC ships are built by numerous shipbuilding organisations, including Synovia Heavy Machinery, Aerofabrique SA, Transec AB, Reyes McLeay Shipyards, Kushan Shipyards and Martian Metal Shipyards, to name a few. As far as specific individuals whom have had influential effects on the UNSC fleet, Tobias Fleming Shaw and Wallace Fujikawa jump to mind, co-designers of the Shaw-Fujikawa Translite engine. They are collectively responsible for allowing humanity to spread out across the cosmos in attainable timespans. The Translite engine gave UNSC ships the ability to traverse space via the hyperdimensions of slipstream space, enabling faster-than-light travel via these hyperdimensions and bringing far-distant systems and planets within reach. But this innovation first happened in April of 2291. In the more modern era, the only major name of note for ship design currently in the lore was that of Robert McLeese, who co-founded the Reyes McLeay shipyards over Mars, and was responsible for many innovations of ships in use by the UNSC, including the honeycomb reinforced structure within some of the Halcyon class light cruisers, of which the Pillar of Autumn was one. and was so successful in her mission that her overall design and template was used for an entire series of heavy cruisers developed after the end of the Human Covenant War, known as Autumn-class heavy cruisers. Chief also talks about liquefaction. Now initially liquefaction I thought was just he had misspoke in some regard, but I actually looked into it and this is a particularly gruesome word used to describe what happens to the body when exposed to extreme levels of high energy radiation. You see, radiation can damage cells and DNA, this is well known, but in extremely high doses with very high energy radiation for prolonged periods of time, particularly in the case of UV radiation, the cell walls actually perforate. This is a phenomenon we actually use in the modern era. UV lights can and are used to sterilize certain things, because the UV radiation breaks down and destroys the cells of microorganisms. To a human, exposed to high levels of high energy UV radiation for prolonged periods of time, the cells in the body quite literally fall apart and release their liquid contents. This cascade effect happens rapidly as cells are broken down, the cells beneath them are then exposed to the radiation, and that just repeats over and over again. Over a period of time, the radiation can disintegrate the body to the point that only bones and a puddle of organic material are left. This is apparently what happened to Quinn, and it, by all appearances, took weeks to mop up the remainders. Might be worth looking into the principle of liquefying the body for the Reapers and how they use biologicals to create new Reapers in Mass Effect, but that's for my other channel. Next, we see Margaret Parangoski being challenged in her role as the leader of the Office of Naval Intelligence. This simply can't happen. It wouldn't happen in the Gold timeline, it's as simple as that. She is the Commander-in-Chief of the Office of Naval Intelligence, and as I've made abundantly clear in previous episodes, you don't get on the wrong side of Synconi without significant risk of a mild case of dead. This Parangoski is decidedly more laid back than the Gold timeline one, although saying that, she did mellow somewhat in her later years as she was handing off to her protege. Next, we have the conversation between Makee and Chief. Makee obviously doesn't exist in the Gold timeline, however she is another reclaimer and thus shares the connection to the Forerunner artifacts that Chief has, as well as an intrinsic connection to each other facilitated by their gene songs, basically genetic engineering that happened to ancestors of the two of them to culminate in these two preeminent individuals, as orchestrated by the Librarian, a member of the Forerunner race that existed 100,000 years before. The scene of Chief slowly walking across the room in contestation to Makee's claims and backing her into a corner, then sitting down to eye level, is a tense moment in the episode. But also in any capacity, coming face to face with a Spartan in this manner, even out of armour, for practically any human alive, would be an intimidating moment, particularly if you were their sole focus and you weren't sure of their intentions. You must bear in mind, we're talking about a human built for war, trained since the age of 6 to kill, standing nearly 7 feet tall, weighing twice as much as a normal person, being painfully pale. Evidence of surgical scarring and battle scarring, a cold but focused and penetrating expression, and if you knew anything of the Spartans' reputations, as Makee does, you'd know this colossal human being is 3 times faster than you'll ever be, strong enough to cave your skull in with a single punch, due in part to their immensely powerful muscles and the metal grafted to their bones. Something similar to this has happened once before, to my memory. In the book The Cole Protocol, Ignacio Delgato went looking for information in a bar on the rubble called Eddie's in the Rock regarding a freighter called the Kestrel that was running smuggling jobs to human colonies. There he was directed to what the barkeep called Miss Universe, being Adriana 111, a Spartan of Grey team. She was out of armour, and as he approached the booth from behind, he noted the wide shoulders, rippling muscular triceps and broad forearms, only to get alongside her and realise she was in fact a woman. Nevertheless, the intimidation factor of that scene versus what we see here in the Silver timeline is of similar, though not identical, calibre. So despite the fact that there is little comparison between the Gold and Silver here, it's noteworthy enough to mention. We next witness something of an interrogation of Halsey, but I'd be addressing similar sentiments I've covered in previous episodes of Gold vs Silver to go over this again. In the scene between Kai and Chief, where Kai discusses her parents possibly still being alive and out there but thinking all this time that their child was dead, this somewhat addresses a point recently raised, or at least relatively recently raised, in the Karen Travis novel surrounding Kilo 5. The Spartan 2 and Spartan 3 programs were morally reprehensible, though you can't argue with the results. The ends justifying the means is an argument that oversimplifies a very complex and interconnected situation. Upon the announcement of the Spartan 4 program, and thus returning to consenting adults as was the case for the Orion program, the precursor to the Spartan program but ultimately a failure, the Office of Naval Intelligence made the choice to try to smooth over the poor moral and ethical decisions of the earlier programs by inciting Halsey as the mastermind behind the plans, when this isn't necessarily accurately representing the truth, and to make efforts to disclose the still active and servicing Spartans' true names and familial contacts, for each individual Spartan to make the choice on what to do with that information. Chief saying that he's working on it in a Silver timeline may be a sideways nod to the protocol to help Spartans reintegrate with humanity and smooth over the dubious moral and ethical concerns of the projects up to the Spartan 4 program. Also, while on the subject of Halsey the war criminal, in the Silver timeline it is beyond contestation that this incarnation of Halsey is the mastermind and war criminal. She bears all of the hallmarks of a narcissistic sociopath with a god complex and absolutely no concern for who she hurts in her progress towards her idolised goal. However, in the book, she is much less black and white. It is clear from her actions in the Fall of Reach that she is remorseful of the actions she is participating in to get the children into the program, including the unethical use of flash clones, kidnapping children, and brutal training and indoctrination to follow, all the way up to the augmentations that would kill half of them. You can tell by her resentment of some of the comments of the Oni agent in regards to acceptable losses that she is not happy with the situation at hand. But she was doing it because she truly believed that it was the only thing that could stop humanity first from destroying itself as tensions between the UNSC and the insurrectionist movement grew to all-out war, up to and including the use of nuclear weapons on densely populated colonies, and second from the implacable alien aggressors that sole focus was to the extinction of humanity. She believed the lives of the 75 children, 75 of humanity's best, being forged into something unbelievably powerful, and their inevitable sacrifice was worth the trade-off if it meant securing humanity's future. However, as the war progressed, it was made abundantly clear that she changed her position. In the Ghosts of Onyx, and moving over into the Kilo 5 trilogy, it became obvious that Halsey had abandoned the sacrifice the few to save the many mentality and was instead attempting to save every single life she could, starting with what she had come to call her Spartans. She somewhat abducted Kelly due to her being sedated due to grievous injuries and knowing the rest of the Spartans would refuse to go willingly. She went to Onyx, where she sent a transmission and support request to Fleet Command to send Spartans to Onyx to help support and attain a Tier 1 asset. When the Spartans arrived, she led them to the shield road at the core of the planet with the intention of keeping as many of them alive as possible, locking them inside and waiting out the war. It was for this reason she was eventually arrested for intervening in Spartan deployment, and this also presented Oni with the opportunity to spin the story to make Halsey the war criminal for Guy to mask their own complacency and in truth direct action in influencing the perpetration of that which they now deemed so unethical as to frame Halsey for the crimes in their entirety. At least in this sense, the Silver Timeline Halsey is seemingly much less complex in that regard, and more complex in her darker and more nefarious personality traits. It's interesting that in the following scenes between Parangosky and Halsey, then, that Parangosky makes arrangements for Halsey to be shipped away at the earliest possible opportunity, citing her admission of guilt to the Master Chief, her risks to security, and her desire to promote Miranda to take over control of the Spartan program. It's almost like we're in fast forward of the Halsey war criminal storyline. Next, we get a look at the armory, with the Spartans of Silver Team checking out upcoming upgraded weapons. Vanek and Riz are discussing the Spartan laser, otherwise known as the Model 6 Grindel Galalian non-linear rifle. They're speaking on the ammo capacity and how it should have between 5 and 6 shots based on the new liquid metal capacitors, but expressing doubt that they actually have the thermal capacity to do so. On the wall displays, the M805X forward acceleration system fulcrum mitigating thruster pack is on display, foreshadowing the ability for Spartans to perform evasive thruster maneuvers, charging through obstacles, Spartan strikes, and other immensely powerful bursts of motion. There also features the armor ability upgrade modules as seen in Halo Reach that attach to the lumbar of the Spartan and grant them drop shields, armor lock, holograms and others. And finally, although it's difficult to make out at some points, I'm pretty sure the armor restraint module seen in Halo 5 is also visible on one of the wall displays, telegraphing the possibility of rogue Spartans in the near future. After a few scenes outlining John and McKee's genetic similarity in regards to their reclaimer status and how John resisting what the artifact is trying to show him is basically killing him, and that McKee tried to school him through the idea that she was taught by the prophets to give in to it entirely and allow the artifact to somewhat take hold is the only way to break through and find peace. Chief decides to take it upon himself to try to use the artifact to find the other, and takes heed to what McKee had told him. McKee and Chief's connection is exemplified here in that their biosigns are literally in symmetry. Chief breaks through and finds himself in what appears to be a dreamlike vista upon the Halo, with McKee. This place, I believe, is the domain. Find peace in the domain. I'm just saying, I've been saying it for years, and now so are they, so, you know. Anyway, I believe it is the domain. To quote Halopedia, as this is the most succinct way I've found to describe it, and even this is highly metaphysical, the domain is an esoteric quantum information repository that was once used by the Foreigners to contain vast amounts of knowledge, most notably their cultural and ancestral records. The domain was an immaterial reserve of knowledge and collective experience viewed by the Foreigners as the essence and living expression of their culture and history. In addition to the ancestral impressions and memories contained within, information could also be stored in and retrieved from the domain for practical purposes. There was a mysterious quality to the domain. Despite its ubiquity in Foreigner culture, its exact nature or origin remained largely nebulous, even to the Foreigners. I won't go too deep into the lore of the domain because it literally permeates into the deepest, darkest corners of the Gold Timeline lore, but I'm pretty sure what Chief and McKee tap into here in the Silver Timeline is the Silver Timeline version of the domain. And as the disconnect happens and Chief returns to the real world, the episode comes to its end. Again, sorry this was a day late. I was pretty swamped with business yesterday that needed my attention, but nevertheless, do you think what we see here is the domain? Do you think that there is a possibility that the TV show is already foreshadowing perhaps the Spartan 4 program and the next Mjolnir platforms? And what would you most like to see in Season 2 in that regard? Hit your comments down below and tune in next Wednesday for Gold vs Silver Episode 7. Until then, I've got plenty of other content lined up, including some most detailed breakdowns of different variants of Mjolnir armour. So, until then, thanks for watching, commenting, liking and subscribing. I just want to give a quick shout out to my patrons and YouTube members: Spartan10148, my Metarch, Dylan, FalconX003, Kenwood, Irrefutable Justice, Leon, Neek and Ramiz, my monitors, Alvin, Andrew, Brand, Brian, Cameron, Chris, Darian, Devon, Flaming Halo, Greenblood, Kyle, Legions Lost, Michael, Prophet Bear, Spartan and Wolf, my sub-monitors, my fleet of Strato Sentinels, my diligent enforcers, and all the other awesome people that have jumped aboard to support the channel over at Patreon. Another shout out to Todd Morrison, my Transcendent YouTube member, and just one quick reminder to support us on all major social media channels including Discord. Much love from 00. Take it easy everyone, and find peace in the domain.